In this video, I want to share with you some practical step-by-step ways to approach compression. And by following these steps, you'll have some confidence and you'll always have a place to start when you're compressing something or when you're even considering compressing something. Because a big part of the issue with mixing and using compression is knowing when to use it. So before I give you the 7 steps and go through that, I've got a Pro Tools session open here and we're going to walk through compressing a bass track. Before we do that, let me give you a couple of pointers before you do anything. So the first thing is, before you do anything, have a goal. That applies to EQ, level adjustments, panning, and especially compression. If you are just opening up a compressor because you think that's what you're supposed to do and you're just doing it by default, you need to stop and take a second. It doesn't have to be you don't have to take 20 minutes to really analyze your motives. You just need to take a few minutes, even just a few seconds, and have a goal and know why you're adding the compression. So a couple questions you can ask yourself: what am I trying to accomplish by adding compression? Another way of wording that is, what is it that I don't like about the sound of this track, and how is compression going to help? So there's some reason you're using compression. If you're just using it because you think you need compression on every track, then stop doing that. Not every track needs compression. There are some songs I've mixed where they were recorded so well and they sounded so good mixed together without any compression that I never added compression. And then there's some songs where almost everything gets compressed, but it always gets compressed for a reason. So if you're listening to a track and you're having problems with that particular track, just ask yourself, what is it? What is it about this track that I don't like and that I'm trying to change by adding compression? If you can't tell me specifically, then compression's probably just going to make your problems even worse, because it's just going to amplify the bad things you don't like, and it's not really going to help the good things that you do like about the sound. That's usually how it works, unfortunately. Okay, for the next portion here, a couple different questions for you to continue down that thought process. So what do you want to do? Do you want to remove peaks? So maybe you have a vocal, and I've had a couple songs I've mixed where the vocal on certain lines, he just sings them a lot louder. Certain words in a phrase get sung a lot louder, and those end up cutting on top of the mix way too much. And turning the volume down doesn't help, because then the rest of the vocal is too quiet, and leaving the volume where it is isn't an acceptable use either, because that causes that loud part of the vocal to cut through, and it kind of hurts your ears and doesn't sound good. So compression is a good idea to use to remove those peaks. Or perhaps you want to turn up the overall volume of the track. As we've talked about, compression can turn down the loud parts or turn up the quiet parts. So if you've got a vocal that's really quiet in sections and louder in other sections, and you want the quieter parts to be louder, more in line volume-wise with the louder sections, then that's a legitimate use for compression. Third thing here is you want to create a tighter sound. I've talked about that. Maybe the bass needs a little bit tighter feel to it, and that's a very subjective term. It may mean different things to you, but if you go through, and like I've said in the previous videos, and you really dedicate some time to learning what compression sounds like, then you'll become more familiar with that tight sound. And so once you know what that sounds like, then you can say, hey, this track could use that. I'd like it to have that nice, tight, compressed sound. Then go ahead and reach for that compressor and start compressing. But if you don't know, then you're just going to cause more trouble for yourself than anything else. Know the answers to these questions every time. You may be wondering, okay, you're just throwing a PowerPoint in here because you feel like you needed to. I bet you don't really use that, do you, Joe? I actually absolutely do. The only time I use compression is after I've listened to the track and I've in my mind said to myself, okay, this needs to be turned down in these sections. This needs to be overall louder. This needs this certain compressed sound that I want. And I already know the sound that I want, so then I can go get it with a compressor. I hardly ever put a compressor on just because I want to. I listen to it, and then if it needs compression, I add it. And if it doesn't, great. The track sounds wonderful. No need to add compression unless it needs something else. If the track sounds amazing, leave it alone. That's probably one of the hardest things to do, especially when you have all these toys and virtually unlimited number of plugins. It's hard to really pull the reins back and have some self-control, but it's hugely important. So that's the reason I took the time to take a few minutes to talk about this before I just jump in and show you the steps of compression, because if you start using the compression without having a goal, you're really just shooting yourself in the foot. Okay, so let's jump in. What are the 7 steps of compression? Well, let me jump over into Pro Tools briefly. I've got a song here off of my album called, the song's called Change. Can somebody help me find my sound? Okay, and we're going to focus on the bass guitar in this track. So here we have the bass. We'll solo it up here. Okay, he played through a sort of a distortion kind of a amp model or pedal, so it has some nice grit to it, which I love. It has a cool sounding bass part, but and we put a little EQ on there, so we're not gonna bother with EQ in this, just the compression. So the tone of the bass is good as far as EQ goes, but when you listen to it in the mix, it's hard to pick it out. Find my sound. I see somebody else. So what I'm hearing here is I can hear the bass, obviously. It's down there. I can hear the low frequencies and it's nice and full, but I can't hear the punch of the bass. When he changes notes, I want each of those notes to kind of go thump, 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 thump. I want it to kind of have that punch to it. Now, he played it fairly well. You can listen to it, and it's got basically what I'm talking about, but it just doesn't cut through once everything else comes into the mix. Okay, so what do I need to do? Well, this is a prime example of why I need compression. So those questions we were just talking about, what's the goal for this? Well, the goal for this is to make it punchier. So it's kind of a combination of making the quiet parts louder and in some ways we're going to make the louder parts louder because we're going to compress. So we're going to come in, and the goal here, if we look at this transient here, is to when he hits these little notes where all the little transients are, I want this beginning of that note to punch, and the rest of the note I don't care as much. I don't want it to be as loud as the first part, but I want the first part to really punch. And so compression is going to help us do that. So why do I know that's what I want? Because I've done that with compression before on bass and drums and different things, and I know that it's capable of giving me that sound. So here's the compressor that I used in the mix, but we're going to turn that off because obviously I want to show you from scratch what we do. All right, so I've got the compressor here and we're ready to go. First thing I want to do, if we look back at our list, is step number 1, choose a ratio. Now that's simple enough, and let's jump over here and take a look. If we set the ratio to 1:1, then we're not doing anybody any good because, or 0:1, for example, then that's not going to help anybody because that's not compressing anything. Now, this particular compressor actually defaults to 3:1, which I would prefer that it didn't do that. I'd rather it default to its lowest setting, 1:1, as opposed to already defaulting to 3:1, because 3:1 is actually a fairly large amount of compression. So what I'm going to do is I want this to compress it a fairly good amount. So rather than starting with a really low threshold or a super high one, I'm thinking this bass is going to do well at like 4:1. And that 4:1 is usually as high as I go for the most part, and I usually compress bass fairly aggressively. So that's why I'm picking a fairly higher ratio here. Okay, so we set the ratio, and we can come back and change this, but that's roughly where I want it to be. So the next step, as you can probably guess, is to come in and set the threshold. So we've got the ratio. We know roughly how much compression is going to be there once it starts compressing. Now we need to know where we want it to start compressing. So we come back to Pro Tools. Here's our threshold here, and we just find that spot where we want it to compress. Now, I'm going to take a second here before we start doing this and tell you there are lots of ways to set the ratio and the threshold, but there are 2 main ways that I use it. And there are 2 very different ways. I'm going to show you what I mean. The first option is probably the more common option that you'll see out there, and that's to set a fairly high ratio and then set the threshold up fairly high so there's only certain notes are coming through and being compressed. So if we look at the meter here, so it's not compressing all the time, it's only compressing when he plays it fairly loudly. And then once he stops playing, it goes back down. So that's one way of doing it. And you just adjust the threshold a little bit here and there, adjust the ratio to compress more or less of those loudest notes. And that's one way to approach it. So that's a good way to chop off the peaks if you use a higher ratio and without really affecting the sound of the signal below those loudest sections. The other way that I like to use compression, and this is probably the way that I use it the most, is I like to set the ratio to something really low. Something like 1.5 to 1, 2 to 1, usually 1.5 to 1. And that's not a lot of compression, especially if you keep the threshold up here. But if you turn the threshold way down, we're talking all the way down to where there's always some compression going on, to where the signal is always above the threshold, then you end up with quite a bit of compression. But since the compression is always on, you don't hear that changeover from uncompressed signal to compressed signal. So it's a much smoother sound. So as you can see, if we look at the meter, there's obviously a lot of compression going on. And we can turn this threshold, the ratio, down even more. And now we're getting roughly the same amount of compression that we were before at a 4 to 1 ratio, and we're at a 1.1 to 1 ratio. And the difference is the threshold is way down here. So anytime the bass player even thinks about playing a note, we already turn the compressor on. Now we're not compressing it a whole lot. If we were to put it way up here, it would look like this, where it's just completely turning it down by 40 dB. That's no good. Nobody likes that. But even at such a low ratio, we're still able to compress it quite a bit, and the compressor is always on. So if you can see where the mouse is here, as the bass gets to right here in level, which is really low, we're compressing, 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 compressing. Whereas if we did the other way, with the threshold up here and the ratio set to something higher, then the bass is here, and as it gets louder, no compression, no compression, no compression, bam, compression, 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 no compression, no compression. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, but I found that a lot of times you can hear the bass isn't compressed here, and then it sounds compressed up here. And you can mess around with the knee like we talked about and make that a smoother transition, but sometimes you can still hear the difference between when it's compressed and uncompressed. With bass, it's not as big of a deal, but a lot of times with vocals, that becomes an issue. So by bringing the threshold way down, almost as far as you can go, and using a really tiny ratio, suddenly there's always a little bit of compression, but it's such a little amount here, and then it gets progressively more. So you'll notice this gain reduction here. If the vocal's really quiet, it's only compressing it just a little tiny bit. And then as it gets louder, then this compression kicks in a little more and a little more. So that's the way, those are two ways I like to do it. For this example, for this bass, since I'm really wanting it to just be punchy on the transients, I'm going to use a little bit higher threshold and a fairly high ratio. But you'll probably see me use that technique as we move forward into some real-world examples in the next video. Okay, so let's look at this one, and we've got our ratio and threshold set roughly. Now we need to listen to the audio and adjust that threshold to where we want it to be. That seems pretty good to me. It's playing along, and it's about 6 dB of gain reduction. Okay, and getting ahead of myself here, the next step of our 7 steps of compression, we chose the ratio, we set the threshold, now we need to adjust the desired amount of gain reduction. So obviously that's a part of setting the threshold, but we're going to adjust that until we get how much gain reduction we want. So by listening to the track and by knowing what we're going for, we're going to listen and adjust the threshold until we get it to the desired amount of gain reduction. I don't like to go more than 10 or 12, so we're going to get probably in the 6 to 12 range. Okay, I think that's the right amount of compression right there. Okay, the next step, as you notice, it's compressing it, so it's getting a lot quieter. So the next step is to adjust the makeup gain. So we've essentially added gain reduction, so we've turned the signal down. Now we need to go back and bring that back up so we can hear it again. Kind of a backwards approach, but that's the idea with compression usually. Okay, so we've turned it down by how much? Looks like we're averaging about 6 dB of gain reduction. So what I like to do, and a good rule of thumb, is to use the makeup gain and simply just turn it up by however much you're turning it down with compression. So if you've got 3 dB of gain reduction, you should add 3 dB back in. If you've got 6 dB, you should add 6, 12, 12, and so on and so forth. The idea here is so that the volume of the track isn't changed dramatically as you listen to the signal with and without compression. So because if you listen before and after, for example, right now, with no compression, it sounds like this. And then without compression, or with compression, it's a quieter signal. So our ears are going to say, well, that louder one sounded better. But that may not necessarily be true. However, if we match how much gain reduction is happening here, we saw it hanging out around -6. We add that back into the signal. Now, when we bypass the compressor on and off, it's going to be roughly at the same volume, so we can A/B between the two and see which one we like better tonally. You can already tell that the compressed bass sound is a good bit punchier. Excuse me. So we're already getting closer to where we want to be. So I'm pretty happy with that sound. We haven't done a huge amount of difference in volume. We could turn this up to make it louder if we wanted to, and that's fine. We may do that just a little bit so we can hear it. And let's move on to the next step. Okay, so we've adjusted the makeup gain, and that's sounding pretty good. The volume's good. Now we need to set the attack. Now, the attack is something, like I mentioned in the earlier videos, it's actually really important. And it's one of those things I never adjusted when I first started mixing and compressing and things. I knew kind of what it did, but I couldn't think of a good reason to actually mess with it. So, I just leave it alone. And that's okay, but there's a lot of extra features that you can't, and sounds that you can't get if you don't mess with the attack. So let's listen to this section here. The attack is default. The default setting here is 10 milliseconds. So let's take a listen to what it sounds like. Okay, so it's got a nice little compressed sound to it, and 10 milliseconds is letting some punch through, but it's chopping it off pretty good. Let's see what happens when we lower the attack. So I'm going to start playback, and we'll lower it down to, say, 2 milliseconds. Listen to it and notice what happens over here on the meters. So it's knocking off a few more dB over here, and the sound sounds a little snappier. It almost sounds like it's clipping a little bit because it's attacking it so fast that you kind of hear a pop in the audio. I'll turn it down a little more, and you can hear it even more. Listen to the transits. When he plays the notes, there's going to be this little popping sound, and that's because the attack is so fast. As soon as the bass starts playing, the compressor's kicking in, and it's turning it down so fast there's a little bit of a pop in the audio. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. That may be exactly what you need to have it cut through, but probably not for bass. If we listen to it in the context of the mix, the bass is still kind of buried down there. That little click that's happening, you can't even hear it. So it's not a bad thing, but it's just not helping things at all. So let's move the attack the other way. Let's say it was originally at 10 milliseconds. Let's move it up to 30. See what that sounds like. Okay, two things you'll notice over here, the amount of compression has gone down a few dB. Why is that? Well, I'll tell you. And I've mentioned this before, but just to review, we're telling it to start compressing later because we're using a slower attack. So instead of starting compression here, it's starting compression maybe over here. And since it's compressing over here, that's a quieter signal, so it's not having to turn it down as much. So as you raise the attack, in other words, make it longer, make the compressor take longer to kick in, it's going to compress less and less. As you lower the attack and make it faster, you'll get more and more compression. Okay, let's set it to something just really long, like, let's say around 100 milliseconds. What does that sound like? Okay. Well, listening to all those different ones, I thought the one around 30 or so sounded the best because it has this, well, I'm going to play it again for you. It has this punch to it. So as you can hear the thump of the transients come through, and it's a little more pronounced than the uncompressed signal, and it sounds better at that attack setting than any of the other ones. It was too fast earlier, down at, in the 1 millisecond or 10 milliseconds, wasn't really punching through. And then at the longer setting, it was taking too long to start compressing, so we weren't really getting that transition between the loud transient of the note and then the quieter sustain of the note. So this is what I like right here. Okay, sounds pretty good. Now, if we were to mess around with the ratio, it'd probably change the sound. We'll get to that in a second. But we've got an attack that we can live with. So let's listen to that before and after. I'll play it with compression and then without and then with compression again. Okay, I adjusted this volume down. There's a little volume difference. Let's listen one more time. I'll play it before without compression and then after with compression. Now, if you're listening to that and you couldn't really hear a difference, that's totally okay. That's the reason I make this. It's an introductory understanding compression video. Go back and rewind it to that section I just played and listen to it over and over. And here's a couple things to listen to. Imagine you can see the bass player playing. Whenever his finger picks a note, I want you to listen to what that sounds like. Before the uncompressed signal, it's kind of just a smooth line of volume. It doesn't get a lot louder as he picks the note than any of the other sections. But when I added compression and had it to a little bit longer attack, now every time he plays the string, you hear this thumping sound. And it kind of sounds like a kick drum. And so it's causing it to punch a little more. So go back, rewind it, and listen to that a couple times, and you'll hear what I'm talking about. Let's listen to that in the context of the entire mix.
Help me find myself.
Excuse me. So now you can hear what the bass sounds like. You can hear when he changes notes and when he plays a note again. Whereas without the compression, if we turn that off, listen to it now, you can't quite make it out.
Help me find myself.
It's just, especially in this section over here, it just gets a little muffled. With compression, we're adding more definition to the sound. So it just punches through a little bit more. All right, so let's move back to our little slide here. So we set the attack. Next, we need to set the release. Now, the release, admittedly, I'll say isn't quite as important as the attack because the release simply just says how quickly does it stop compressing. And I usually just leave this to a default, something that's fairly musical sounding. But sometimes you want it to do a longer release to where it's compressing more of the time. But the problem with that, setting it to a really long release, is between notes, the compression doesn't turn off. Watch as I play this. When it gets to this section here, notice that the compression is still way down here. Whereas if I had a faster release, then the compressor turns off between these notes. See how it turned back off? That's for the particular thing that we're doing, where we're trying to get the bass to punch through. A faster release is really crucial because we need the compressor to turn off between phrases so that punch comes back in, because the punch is coming from the uncompressed signal coming through the compressor before the compressor turns on, like we talked about with the attack. But if we set a really long release, then what's happening is it's compressing this signal, and then the release is telling it to hang on to that compression for a while. And what's happening is it's compressing and holding that note, holding that compression over these pauses here, these gaps in the audio. And so the compressor's never turning off, so we don't get that punch when he starts playing the bass again. Listen to it again. So I'll put a long release and listen to what it sounds like. It kind of sounds like the original audio at this point because the compressor is just on at all times and never turns off. So it just doesn't punch as much. If I turn this down back to around, say, 70 or so. Now each of those notes has more punch. I can turn it down even more if I wanted to. Doesn't really matter at this point. The main difference is super long doesn't sound good. Fairly short sounds better. Now, some things like vocals or big pads and things that hold out long notes, a longer release is fine because you're allowing the note's going to be there for a while. But anything that's percussive, you don't want a really long release because you want the compression to stop between sections so that it kicks back in when the note starts up again. So I tend to keep these fairly low. I rarely make a long release. If anything, it's more for an effect than anything. All right, so there we go. We set the release. Now, the 7th step is kind of a no-brainer, but it's really important. Are we done with this bass track? Maybe, maybe not. But the important part is that we readjust as necessary. So once we've got this sound, obviously we're going to make a lot of these decisions not listening to a soloed bass track. That doesn't help anybody. We want to listen to it in the context of the mix. So we listen to it here.
Find myself.
And so maybe we decide that we could see what some more compression sounds like. So we'll maybe turn the threshold down a little bit, turn the ratio up, and turn up the gain a little bit. Let's see what that sounds like.
Find myself.
Okay, that's not too different. Let's turn the ratio way up and see what happens.
Find myself.
Okay, that seems to sound a little bit better, but it's a little quiet. We're compressing it by about 10 dB now, so let's turn that up a little bit and take a listen.
Find myself. When I look, I see somebody else.
Oh yeah, now that has the punch that I'm looking for. The bass almost sounds like a kick drum. It doesn't interfere with the kick drum necessarily, but now it has that punch. And so when we get to the verses, it sounds fantastic. Take a listen.
Just like the leaves of fall, I'm changing, I'm dying, do the colors look beautiful when I'm changing, when I'm dying.
At this point, when you listen to this track, if you're listening to the bass, you have no doubt as to when he's playing his notes. And because he's playing so percussively and so like start and stop sort of style, then we need that compression there to really allow it to punch. Listen to that verse without compression.
Just like the leaves of fall,
Notice how the bass kind of just sounds soft. Kind of sounds like it's there, but it's not really aggressive. Now with compression, every one of those notes cuts through really nicely.
just like the leaves of fall, I'm changing, I'm dying, do the colors look.
It just has more punch. And that's exactly what I wanted to do in this song. So that goes back to that first little thing that we talked about at the beginning of this video. What is your goal for this track? This is what I wanted to do with this track. I wanted it to have more punch. I wanted it to let the first little transient through and make it nice and loud and then compress the rest. And that's exactly what I got out of this track. So we've looked at our step-by-step guides. If you want to write these down, print it out, take it up, tape it up to the side of your monitor as you're mixing and working on a mix, be a nice reminder. So you choose a ratio, set the threshold, and then adjust those two until you have the desired amount of gain reduction. So how many dB do you want to knock off? And that's going to be a guessing game at first. You're not going to know. But over time, you're going to know what 3 dB of dynamic range or gain reduction sounds like versus 12 dB. So then adjust the makeup gain to get it sounding roughly the same volume again. Then set your attack and release to kind of dial in the sound of that compressor, and then go back and readjust all the settings until you have it exactly how you want it. And that's really, it's as simple as that. No matter what you're compressing, whether it's a kick drum, a vocal, a bass, a violin, whatever it is, you've got the same tools available to you, and you can get all sorts of sounds, but you got to know how they work and have sort of a process for how you're going to approach that. And I think with this 7-step compression, the steps that I've laid out for you, I think you're going to have a good starting point, and you're going to become more and more comfortable as you begin to compress things more and more. I'm not talking about using more and more compression, but the more and more you get practice using compression, you're going to be able to use it really well to where your mixes sound good and they don't sound overcompressed, but you're using compression as it was meant to be used, as a tool to make your mixes sound better. Okay, I hope this video was helpful for you. Go back and watch it again if you need a refresher. And that's what it's here for. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next video.